So, thank you everyone for coming, braving the cold tonight. For those of you for whom this is your first event, firstly, a very big welcome. We're the Oxford Hayek Society. We've been around since 1983, promoting the principles of free markets and limited government in Oxford. Tonight, we're delighted to have Tom Harwood join us. This will be our very last speaker event of the term, and I'm sure it's going to go down extremely well. I've known Tom Harwood for quite a while now, and he's a wonderful speaker, wonderful supporter of free markets and limited government. Currently working at Guido Fawkes as a political commentator, but most of you might well know him from previous headlines he made, whether it was during the referendum campaign or indeed during the viral NUS Delegate video, none of us have forgotten it. Tom will give a talk, and then we'll go forward to Q&A. Just so that everyone's aware, we'll be audio and video recording the event, but only Tom's in shot. So, lovely. Without further ado, Tom, thank you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to make clear that I didn't specify that only I should be in shot. I mean, it's fun and narcissistic and everything, but that was not my decision. And sorry again to drag you away from what I gather is a riveting debate on BBC Two tonight with the second tier of politics in this country. We have such heady heights, such household names as Rishi Sunak from the Conservatives. The absolute highlight. Rebecca Long Bailey as well is speaking there, and some of the little parties that somehow think they matter. It's so I'm sorry to drag you away from that, but hopefully this will give you a bit of an insight into daily life in Westminster, although that's sort of toned down now that everyone's gone out to the real country. It's quite interesting how some parties like the Liberal Democrats have sort of changed tack in the last 3 or so days after they've realised that a policy geared towards people who shout at Parliament just on Abingdon Green by all the news cameras doesn't go down so well in the southwest, or the Midlands, or the North, or North Norfolk, or anywhere that they're trying to retain seats. I think the YouGov MRP projection from Wednesday night, this most accurate of granular polls that got it bang on last time round, showed that the Lib Dems, far from having their moment of delivering that Remain moment, that sweeping changing of politics, will go up by 2 seats from last time, and actually down by 8 from the total that they had from all their defectors by the end of this Parliament. So perhaps it wasn't the wisest decision of Jo Swinson to so gung-ho back that election, which would not have happened if the SNP and Lib Dems hadn't come to that agreement. But no, thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's great fun to get out of Westminster, and it was a little bit of a relief to get out of London today of all days. Actually, I was meant to be in London Bridge a little bit earlier, but that gig was cancelled after the whole area was shut down. It is a reminder, I suppose, of how these things really matter, and a bit of a worry going into the election in terms of how political decisions can change things on the spin of a coin. But I'm glad that there is a society like this in Oxford, particularly I gather you're quite proud of the name Hayek Society. I notice whenever I go to the London School of Economics, where of course Hayek taught, there's no mention of him there. There's no lecture theatre named after him, no society, no... So I'm glad that that name does live on, even if it's somewhere that Hayek never taught at or learned at. It's a bit like Margaret Thatcher, actually. Her archives are over in Cambridge, despite having been to Oxford. There was no Oxford College when she stopped being Prime Minister that would take on that collection. And it was down to Churchill College, Cambridge, to take that on. It seems like this is a bit of a theme. I'm not sure if there's any... when was the last time we had a Prime Minister from Cambridge? I'm not sure that we have in a long time. But if there were to be one, I'm sure that their archives would end up at Oxford. It seems to be the thing. You sort of swap around university to university. But I've been working at Guido Fawkes for around, just coming up to 2 years, I suppose. And it is a fascinating time in British politics. When I joined, David Davis was still Deputy Secretary, if you can remember such a time, many Deputy Secretaries ago. Theresa May was still Prime Minister. Chequers was just about to be announced as policy. before the withdrawal agreement, before the revised withdrawal agreement, before Boris Johnson, before all this seismic politics that I think if you were to teach it, if you were to sit down and sort of go event by event, you'd think it would span a decade, far less than 1.5 to 2 years. I mean, this has really been a moment of politics that I don't think we've experienced since one of those really seismic turns. I mean, we do have these moments in politics, you know, the 1979s, the 1945s, the 1929s. These sort of big seismic events do tend to happen each generation. It seems to be relatively methodical, but this one, by virtue of the chaotic nature of the last snap election and particularly parliamentary wrangling, seems to have thrown in to be a lot more chaotic and unpredictable than any that has preceded it. And that has made it particularly interesting to be in the throng of it, to be swanning around Parliament as I get to do in my role at Guido. We sort of sit up as the cheekier people who attend lobby sessions and get to sit in the chamber watching those seismic debates, and most importantly go to the pubs where there is subsidised beer. So thank you, taxpayers. That's which is actually one of the frustrations of being in an election period when Parliament isn't sitting, when no one's in those pubs. Suddenly we have to go to the ones that are outside Parliament, and suddenly the price of a pint doubles. But maybe that's one of the. I can understand why the coalition, which was quite happy to cut in a number of places, stood back from cutting that might affect those voting. But no, this is a very interesting time. It's a fun one to report. For those of you that don't know much about Guido, we sort of try and uncover and demystify and publish the parliamentary plots, rumours, conspiracies, fast-paced news, and get it out. We publish between 10 and 18 stories a day, just sort of what's going on in the political world. And rose, before I joined, so I'm not going to be boasting really here, but to be the most read political blog in the UK, and specifically read by those in the corridors of power. So it's very interesting getting the tip-offs that we do. It's quite funny, we can tell when there's an internal election, for example in the Green Party, because suddenly a lot of anonymous email addresses are flooding in with stories about factional infighting from one side to the other. Suddenly you sort of get a different insight in terms of how backstabby certain political people can be. It's the nature of politics. It's filthy. People are really jabby. You can uncover and unpick how unbenevolent the people who tend to set the rules are, and really, if anything, working at Guido has confirmed my belief that these people should have as little power as possible. and the more you get to know politicians, the more you think, hang on, why are these people in control of anything? So it's a very life-affirming job in that sense. It's a philosophy-affirming job as well. So that's a bit of background in terms of what I do now. As Matthew mentioned, I've done a few things previously in other lives, and particularly when I was a student as well. So in questions, feel free even, Diane at that moment, to throw absolutely anything open, contemporary politics, what it's like in the media landscape, in broadcast, or indeed in student politics. Happy to take absolutely anything. So with that, I guess I'll open to the floor.
I'll let Tom chair the questions, but I'll take, as President, very first privilege. So you've been very much sort of making appearances now in favour of supporting the Conservative Party. Even when sort of Boris Johnson was running his campaign, I know you were quite vocally in favour of him, be it on Question Time or the Telegraph, even recently now Free Market Conservatives, and of course in Guido. So one of the things that actually was a big sort of debate amongst members of our society was, especially among those who supported a real hard Brexit, why not support the Brexit Party? What is it about the Conservative Party that we should be supporting?
That's a very interesting question. I thought that you were going to go to the other side then. I thought because, I mean, in a lot of libertarian circles, it used to be until about 2 or so years ago, why not the Lib Dems? Which has become an incredibly easy question to answer, especially in the last few years. So yes, why not the Brexit Party? Well, from a free market perspective, this is not a party that is ideologically consistent. They were absolutely necessary in terms of getting politics back on track in those European elections. I think without them, we'd be in a very dark place now, not just in terms of how Parliament would look, but actually how politics would look on the street. You need that sort of impetus for politicians to realise that if they don't deliver on the mandate of that referendum, then there are electoral consequences. And so without the Brexit Party, I don't think we would have seen that change in the Conservative Party. And we can discuss in terms of the current leadership, in terms of the current proposals that we've seen, and the announcement today, for example, on state aid rules, there are certainly questions to be raised as to how much better the next administration will be than Theresa May, but we can see that the people at the top of the Conservative Party now, the people who are put in those positions of power within the cabinet, whether it's the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, whether it's the Home Secretary Priti Patel, whether it's the Chancellor Sajid Javid, these are people who have consistently been on the free market wing of the party and who have spoken and written very consistently about the benefits of small L liberalism, free markets, free people. And so that's very encouraging in terms of the talent that's rising up through the Conservative Party, in terms of those appointments to those positions, that we're going to see a party that looks very different to that of Theresa May. I mean, I was even taken aback as someone who was quite enthusiastically in favour of Boris Johnson in terms of his cabinet reshuffle in the summer, in terms of his clear out of the sort of dirge-like, grey, managerial class that we saw under Theresa May, the people who didn't really get into politics to do things. They got into politics to be things. They saw themselves as a managerial class that likes to that thinks they're better planners than the other lot, but ultimately is the philosophy all that different? If you think, oh, I could probably plan what happens here better, it's still a centralised system. It's still a system that doesn't trust people to get on with their own lives. So I think that's an ideological shift that we've seen in the Conservative Party, if not yet in policy, certainly in personnel. Whereas with the Brexit Party, there's a very confused policy mishmash, there we go, there eventually. They're a party that's very clear on regulatory autonomy, and that's absolutely key constitutionally. But then they're a party that is not united by any stretch of the imagination in terms of what to do with that regulatory autonomy when you get it back. Because of course Brexit is not an inherently free market thing. There are plenty of people who want to take back control over the entire regulatory regime from the European Union in order to have much greater control from the state, from London. And there are others who obviously want to not only devolve power from Brussels to London, but also to individuals and individual communities. And that is a battle that is not settled within the Brexit Party. You have Brexit Party policy about investing billions upon billions in what they feel to be left behind communities. And whilst there's certainly a case for rebalancing the country, and I think that's probably the right thing to do, we've got to question the solutions that the Brexit Party are offering, which don't seem to be particularly full. They're a useful pressure group to an extent, but are they a coherent policy platform for government? I'm not convinced. Yes?
I mean, I agree with you to some extent that the Brexit Party does have a slightly kind of odd mixture of policies, and some of them are quite free market, some of them quite statist and so on. But you just said that they're not ideologically consistent. In what way is the Conservative Party ideologically consistent? In what way has the Conservative Party actually been conservative for the last few decades? Apart from tax cuts, can you name one actual Conservative policy they've actually pursued?
Yeah, I think that this is something that was really fundamental to the leadership race in the summer, and that shift from what I totally agree under the last administration was not conservative, or was a very different sort of conservatism. It was an Angela Merkel style Christian democracy.
Modernised.
It was a small c conservatism to many senses. I mean, sort of centering around family, centering around community. That sort of Nick Timothy vision that didn't extend to the economic sphere, sort of buying into these arguments that the only solutions were those that spent. But actually, I think it's in the current climate, looking at the manifesto, which promises to spend £1 for every £36 that the Labour Party is spending. And that's only the spending that they committed to in their manifesto. I know they spent another 58 billion on Monday. I don't know how many more billions they've spent since then. It seems that they're coming out with another billion every few days. It's quite extraordinary how we had their West Midlands manifesto launched today. I don't know if anyone caught that. They seem to be launching a different manifesto every day. I mean, the Conservative Party in 2017 were criticised for sort of equivocating in the manifesto pledges. The Labour Party seems to be revising what they're offering almost on a continual basis. But no, it's important. It's an important point over the Conservative Party, and I am pleased with the noises that are coming out of raising that national insurance threshold. I see that as a path to abolishing national insurance, merging it with income tax. That sort of double tax has to go. But beyond tax, there's also the way that we look at society. And I know, for example, some of the appointments in number 10 have started to look at organisations that get government funding. There are lots of trade unions and charities and lobby groups, really, that have, it ballooned in the Blair years, but for decades received a lot of government funding to then go and lobby the government to spend more money on X, Y, and Z. It's a peculiar system. I know that that's just one example of proactive approach that this number 10 is taking to try and make the state more efficient in that sense, and not fund people who are only going to pay themselves a lot to then go and tell the government to do things that it didn't want to do and that aren't ideologically consistent.
But what happened to the bonfire of the quangos under David Cameron?
Yeah,
It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. It didn't happen. I think it happened for the first year, and then he started making new quangos, because when you sort of settle in as a politician, it becomes very handy to hand off responsibility to or quasi-accountable bodies. But I think that there's a different, more revolutionary ethos in this number 10. It's that vote leave team. I was privileged enough to work a bit on vote leave in those offices and know quite a lot of those people who have now gone into number 10. And it's not that sort of Macmillanite, fusty conservatism that I think has sometimes sort of set itself in thinking, oh, do we really want to change things? This is a team that is passionate about change. And I think that it's understandable that we're not going to see an avalanche of radicalism this side of Brexit, or this side of an election particularly. But I think I'm confident in the mindset of the people in those positions of influence and power. And whilst I'm yet to see the incredible policy agenda that I'd like, I recognise that that's the next hurdle, the next fight. The most important thing is to defeat this neo-Marxist opposition party that came so close last time round. That has to be the ultimate priority. And then there's the next battle. And that next battle will, I think, be pushing on an easy door to push with the next government in terms of shifting that balance of power from the collective back towards the individual. Yes?
Are you worried about the Conservative Party's spending pledges? Because even though many could make the argument that David Cameron never really followed through with austerity, they've kind of thrown that completely out the window. And a lot of their proposals just, in my opinion, would have been what Blair had been proposing a few years ago. And as the debt is rising and it has risen, we need to balance the books a lot more now than ever, especially the aging population. And even though I do support the Conservative Party selection, that's one thing I'm very worried about. What's your opinion?
Yeah, it's an intractable issue because the public gets bored. No matter how much they sort of buy into the arguments at the beginning, they get to the stage of, well, why hasn't this happened yet? And it is interesting to note that some of the sort of conservative or classically liberal heroes of the last few decades, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, they were awful with deficit spending. They ballooned the size of the national debt. Although in both of those examples, both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in their time in office, although they ballooned the size of the deficit and the debt, they set up the economic conditions that then in the next decade in both countries allowed those countries to have a surplus, which both America and the United Kingdom did by the end of the 1990s. So I think that to some extent there needs to be a bit of leeway in terms of the absolute priority of defeating socialism. But in the other, I think that sometimes we can undervalue what happened during the coalition years. When David Cameron came to power in 2010, the government was borrowing £1 for every £4 it spent, which I did not believe when I read that last year. I had to go and actually look up the number. It was £1 in every four. 25% of government expenditure was borrowing. It's almost unimaginable, that sort of carelessness of public finance. By 2018, that was down to £1 out of every 36, 37 that were being spent. And the debt started falling as a percentage of GDP, which, although in real terms is less tangible, in economic terms matters. So I think that to some extent, it's a win to hold public spending in line with expectation, and that naturally, through a growing economy and through a small level of inflation, does whittle down. But that being said, when you get to the state of a country being more satisfied with the services that are being delivered and a more prudent government, you can have spending reductions that don't feel like austerity. And it should be the natural way for a government to act, to think constantly about where savings can be made, which programs should be scrapped. That should be not something that happens once in every 10 years as a big wall that makes people feel like this is a national crisis, but something that happens consistently throughout the course of a government term, and then it doesn't feel like we're all in it together, this is hardship. It's just natural management of finances that any individual or corporation would do. Why shouldn't governments? And that, I think, is the ethos that needs to be driven through. But it's so important that groups like this and think tanks, pressure groups, individuals hold the government's feet to the fire, because the tendency within government is to get lazy, and they always will. And so it's very, very important, because you know that there are interest groups in every sector that are asking for more money here, higher taxes there, greater regulation on what you eat, what you consume, what you watch, how you live. It's so important to push back against that, because otherwise the government will always, in a society, be pulled in one way. Yes?
So at Vote Leave, you knew Dominic Cummings, and obviously you will have seen sort of how he works and the mind behind the mask. Obviously, since he joined Boris in number 10, there's been a bit of a meme both on and off Twitter, sort of hashtag classic Dom, with all the chaos that's ensued in various ways. How much of that chaos, how much of what actually happened since Boris came into power, do you think has actually been planned by Cummings? How much do you think it's actually gone to plan for him, and do you think he's essentially done what he intended to do when he came in?
I think the ends are broadly the plan. I think there were definitely some hiccups. This was a number 10 that would have preferred an election before Brexit happened. This is a number 10 that I think had planned for that prorogation announcement furore and that first push for an election vote. The expectation was that opposition parties wouldn't chicken out of that to a greater or lesser extent, and that would be delivered as something that was much more obviously a Brexit election. The trickiness with this election is trying to get that narrative back onto Brexit, which slid away last time round. And we saw with the press conference this morning with Boris and Gisela and Michael all back together again in that same building. They tried to move that narrative. Obviously, other events have shifted that today, so I think at the beginning of next week we'll probably see another push towards bringing that public consciousness back towards, hang on, look how horrible the last 2 years were. Do we really want another hung parliament that delivers that kind of instability? But I think that to some extent, Dom would revel in the fact that journalists and opposition politicians are sort of doubling over themselves, trying to think, where's the strategy? What's the master plan? Is this part of this 7D chess game? And sometimes it might be, but to be honest, politics is more often cock-up than conspiracy. And I think a lot of the time, journalists and political observers on the left obsess far too much over the minutiae. We saw, for example, the Tories' Twitter game, whether it's changing the handle of CCHQ Press to Fact Check UK, or whether it's putting out Comic Sans type posters saying, get Brexit done, only on Twitter, only going to a few tens of thousands of people, basically all of whom know how to vote already. It's quite clear that this is all angled at winding up journalists. And it works so well. It works so well. It completely destroys the narrative of the opposition when something that honestly, if every journalist ignored, would not affect the election in any way whatsoever. CCHQ has about 50,000 followers on Twitter. They changed their name and tweeted out some rebuttal of the Labour Party during a debate. It led the news for like 2 days. CCHQ was skipping happy. They were absolutely laughing because it's like having a strategy that you don't really want to be explored too much over here, and then thinking, how do we distract the opposition? How do we make sure that we can disrupt, for example, the Lib Dem manifesto launch? We go, oh, look over here, look what's going on Twitter. And then suddenly the media descends to that and in its very insular way starts talking about something that doesn't change a single person's vote out in the country, because most people in the country think that all politicians are lying crooks anyway. And it absolutely sets up the media class to live within this intractable bubble where they're all talking to themselves about a Twitter account they all follow. It's extraordinary how easy it is to sort of distract and disorientate the opposition. I think that's what this number 10 and CCHQ are doing quite well at this election, and it might lead to some surprises later on. Yeah.
On the note of kind of the use of social media, I was reading the other day about the, I'm not sure if you've seen it, you probably have, the Rob Delaney NHS video that Labour produced, and it has, I think it was suggested it has something like 10 million views across many platforms. It's doing really well. And it's interesting, I suppose, because of the last election, the Ivory ban and the kind of animal welfare stuff, that Labour kind of focuses on these niche issues, and they seem to have quite deep penetration with not just the media, but real voters. How do you think, if you were comparing first Labour's efforts in this election with their social media efforts in the last election, and then between the two parties, because it seems like the Tories have got certainly their Twitter game is better now. I saw that if you want Brexit done, you have to vote for it. What was it? The Thatcherite post, if you want a better life, you have to vote for it. So there seems to be some improvement, but I'd be curious as to your kind of thoughts on the quality.
Yeah, I think it's too easy to obsess over Twitter, I think, which is something that basically just journalists and obsessives are on. But it's certainly giving CCHQ the time of their lives. There's an Australian firm that's doing all the digital stuff called Randall and Albin, and they put out a what do they call it? Boris Wave beats chillax / get Brexit done to. I mean, great in-joke memery. It's not going to win the election, but it's great fun. It just shows that the Conservative Party is a bit more in touch now with internet culture, which I'm not sure how important electorally that is, but it does give this sort of mood music to the campaign, which filters through to more mainstream media. On the question of the Labour Party, they have got about 1,000,001 messages. It seems like they have special interest offers to just about everything. You know, giving free vests to this group, they're planting whatever it is, 2 million trees a minute to that group. I mean, all this sort of stuff that's very targeted to groups. And there is There was earlier this week a sort of worry that the Labour Party, within Labour circles, that they didn't have as structured a message as the Conservative Party, which has basically 4 pledges this election, however you dress them up: get Brexit done, 20,000 more police officers, levelling up education funding, and all the new hospital upgrades. That's basically the Conservative message, and I said it in about 10 seconds. The Labour message is much more complicated, although ultimately they're trying to drag everyone into this NHS conspiracy theory. It's interesting because this is what the Labour Party have done in every single election since at least the 1980s, and they've lost quite a few of those elections. There's certainly a section of the population that genuinely buys into the conspiracy theory that in 5 years' time people will have to pay for healthcare in this country. I don't think that there are many people who are seriously switched on. I don't think that there are many people who even try and sell this message that genuinely believe that, even on the Labour Party side. I don't know how many people buy into their own propaganda and conspiracy theories, but it is interesting how they are trying to set in that message discipline. We sort of do a rundown at the end of each day in terms of what each party's top lines are for the day, what their big messages. And I'd say easily 3/4 of the days of so far of this election, the top line from the Labour Party has been basically trade deal, NHS, sell, Trump. This is their message. And they are being pretty consistent on it. It's not their first time at the radio. These are people who are being advised to a great extent actually by Bernie Sanders' team from the US, and trying to filter through that message discipline. It is a stretch though to base your entire political campaign on a conspiracy theory. It will be interesting to see how far that penetrates. I'd like to see focus group data in terms of how many people believe it, because a lot of it might just be that bit of mood music, that bit of unease. Yeah, no, he's probably not gonna make the NHS private, but there's a worry there. That's basically their strategy. It will be interesting to see how far that flows through and how far the salience of Brexit will override that. I think what the